I still remember the smell in that hallway, a mix of stale coffee and floor disinfectant, the kind of scent that clings to long years and longer loyalties. I had given nearly 3 decades to Halberd Dynamics, a software firm based in Cleveland, and for the longest time, I believed I'd retire from that place. Maybe even die at my desk if the job didn't kill me first. That morning, I was coming back after 6 months of medical leave, recovering from pancreatic cancer, the kind of illness that comes with statistics nobody likes to say out loud. But I had survived. What I didn't realize was that survival in this world doesn't always mean you get your place back. As I walked into the open office floor, still a bit unsteady from the last round of chemo, something felt off. Not the furniture or the lighting, those were unchanged, but the people. Or, more precisely, the way they looked at me. Briefly, then away, with that particular discomfort reserved for the dying or the forgotten. I nodded at a few familiar faces. Most didn't nod back. Then I noticed a young man I'd never seen before, sitting at what used to be my desk. He was typing rapidly on a sleek new laptop, a Bluetooth headset in his ear, and a nameplate freshly minted, Mason Beckett, Project Strategy Associate. I took a step forward, meaning to introduce myself, or maybe just to ask who he was, when a voice called from behind me, flat, emotionless, efficient. "Mr. Travis, please head to the 5th floor. Mr. Whitman would like to speak with you immediately." My stomach tightened. Whitman. It took a second to connect the name Alan Whitman, the founder's only son, recently named CEO after his father suffered a sudden stroke and took early retirement. Whitman was barely in his 30s, polished, Ivy League, all sharp suits and sharper intentions. Rumor had it he was brought in to trim the fat. Still, I never once thought I'd be the fat, especially not after everything I'd built: the East Coast client network, the legacy accounts, the training programs. Hell, I had trained his father's assistant. The elevator ride to the 5th floor felt like walking a plank. I gripped my leather briefcase like it was the last proof of my worth. Part of me still hoped maybe he wanted to welcome me back personally. Maybe it was a formality. But when the elevator doors opened and I saw Whitman standing there without a smile, without a handshake, just a nod toward his office, I knew this wasn't a welcome. The office on the 5th floor had changed. Gone were the familiar photos of company milestones or the framed letters from grateful clients I'd once helped land during leaner years. Now the walls were bare, the lighting too clinical, and the scent of expensive cologne still lingered in the air like a declaration of new ownership. Alan Whitman stood behind a wide glass desk, not a single document in front of him, just a sleek tablet and a silver pen that he tapped rhythmically against the surface, more like a prop than a tool. He didn't look up when I walked in, didn't ask me to sit, didn't offer a word of welcome back. Instead, he let the silence stretch for just long enough to remind me that this wasn't a conversation. It was a decision already made. "You've been with Halberd a long time, Mr. Travis," he said finally, his voice calm in the way that felt scripted, almost indifferent. 32 years, right? 33. I corrected him, not out of pride, but out of principle. When you've sacrificed birthdays, anniversaries, and your own health for a company, the years aren't just numbers, they're currency. And I had spent mine all in one place. He nodded once, more to himself than to me, then folded his hand. "We're moving in a new direction. Leaner, faster, sharper. That means reevaluating some legacy roles." The word legacy hit harder than I expected. It sounded polite, but I knew exactly what it meant. Outdated, replaceable, a relic. He might as well have handed me a museum label instead of this thinly veiled dismissal. "I'm not sure I follow," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though a dull ache had begun to settle somewhere deep in my gut. "I've been overseeing client development on the East Coast since we had 3 clients and no office in Manhattan. If this is about performance..." "It's not," he interrupted, with a soft chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not about anything you've done wrong. It's just that we need to be agile now. We can't carry the weight of the old model while trying to build something new." Old model. I stood there, 58 years old, fresh out of chemotherapy, a little thinner, maybe a little slower, but with 33 years of knowledge no spreadsheet could quantify, and I realized in that moment that it had never been about performance, it was about perception. In his eyes, I wasn't a pillar of the company. I was a remnant of an era he was trying to erase. Then he leaned back, smiling faintly like someone satisfied after delivering a clever line, and added, "We'll be offering a standard severance package. 2 weeks. We'd appreciate it if you could have your things cleared out by end of day." My ears rang. It wasn't shock, not entirely. It was the sound of everything I had endured, everything I had contributed, everything I had survived being condensed into a casual, administrative goodbye. "You knew I just came back from cancer treatment," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. Not as a plea, not even as an accusation, but as a simple truth I wanted recorded in the silence between us. He shrugged. "That's unfortunate timing, but it doesn't change the needs of the business." Something inside me settled then, not broken, not defeated, but eerily still, like the hush that falls before a long storm. I reached into my briefcase, took out my company badge, and placed it gently on the corner of his desk. "Good luck, Mr. Whitman," I said, voice calm, hand steady. And I meant it, just not in the way he assumed. When I returned to the main floor, the office had gone silent. A few heads peeked over cubicle walls, some looked away quickly, while others simply stared, unsure whether to say something or disappear behind their monitors. No one spoke. I didn't expect them to. The kind of courage it takes to stand up for someone isn't found in corporate handbooks. It's forged over time. And time, I now understood, was a luxury most of them were too scared to spend. I packed my things slowly, methodically, the old photo of my daughter from her college graduation, the plaque I got in 7 for negotiating our first $1 million contract, the mug that read "World's Most Tired Strategist," and slid them into a cardboard box that felt far too small for everything I was really leaving behind. As I walked out the door, I didn't look back, not because I wasn't heartbroken, but because I knew the real story wasn't ending, it was only pausing, waiting to pivot. Because what Alan Whitman didn't know, what he hadn't even bothered to ask, was that I wasn't just some tired old manager he could replace with a younger, cheaper, glossier version. I was the architect of our single most valuable investor relationship, the one with Huntington Ventures, and we were weeks away from closing a deal so critical that its failure would ripple across every department in the company. And that deal, it included a clause, one I had personally demanded, that any termination of essential personnel would trigger immediate contract renegotiation, or worse, complete withdrawal. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Cleveland, the city lights turning soft through my windshield, I didn't feel rage. Not yet. What I felt was something more precise, more focused, the slow burn of clarity. Whitman thought he had ended my chapter. He had no idea he'd just lit the match. By the time I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, the cardboard box in my passenger seat felt heavier than it should have, not from weight, but from everything it represented. A career packed up in 20 silent minutes. The rain had started to fall by then, soft and steady, coating the windshield in a watery haze that blurred the edges of the world. And for a moment, I just sat there, watching the droplets race each other down the glass while the engine ticked its cooling rhythm. It wasn't grief I felt, not exactly, and it wasn't even anger, at least not yet. What settled into my chest was something colder and far more certain, the knowledge that Alan Whitman had made a mistake far bigger than he realized. You see, I wasn't just another manager with a dusty office and a fading nameplate. I was the person who had personally nurtured, over nearly a decade, the relationship that now underpinned Halbert's biggest shot at national expansion, a deal with Huntington Ventures, a private investment group based out of Boston, with the kind of capital and influence that could shift an entire company's trajectory overnight. That partnership didn't come from a handshake at a conference or a lucky phone call. It was the result of years of midnight strategy sessions, last-minute travel to client sites, and countless hours building trust that couldn't be quantified in a quarterly report. And embedded deep within the preliminary agreement I had negotiated, an agreement Whitman had probably skimmed at best, was a clause I had fought for during a particularly tense 3-hour call with Huntington's legal team. Any material change to project leadership, particularly involving designated key personnel, would require the deal to be immediately reevaluated. If trust was broken, the agreement could be paused, renegotiated, or voided entirely. And I had ensured my name was listed as such a person, not out of ego, but because I understood exactly how delicate real trust can be in corporate America. Alan didn't know that. He didn't bother to ask. And in dismissing me with that hollow speech about agility and streamlining, he had unwittingly pulled the pin from a very expensive grenade. As I stepped into my house, setting the box down on the hallway table, my phone buzzed with a message that felt like the first tremor before an avalanche. It was from Caitlin, one of the junior analysts I had mentored for years, the kind who stayed late because she believed in the work, who always double-checked the numbers even when nobody asked her to. Her text was brief, just 6 words, but they hit with the weight of a verdict. "Is it true? Are you gone?" I replied with the same clarity I had used when I walked out that morning. "Yes." Effective immediately. There was a long pause, then a second message. "They don't know what they've done." And she was right. Because that morning, Whitman had strutted into his glass office like a man stepping into destiny. But by tomorrow morning, he would be pacing that same room, desperately trying to explain how he jeopardized the biggest investment in Halbert's history, all because he didn't think to read a personnel clause. Or worse, didn't think I mattered enough to be included in one. I spent that night not pacing, not brooding, but sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea that had gone cold long before I realized I hadn't tasted it, my mind tracing every thread of the deal with Huntington, the timelines, the deliverables, the dependencies, and, most importantly, the people. I thought of Jonathan Pierce, their lead partner, a man who didn't suffer fools, and who once told me over a late dinner that the only reason he hadn't walked away from a competitor's offer was because, and I quote, "You're the only one over there I trust to shoot me straight." Tomorrow I knew that trust would be tested. At 7:13 a.m. My phone buzzed again, this time from Daniel Vega, a longtime friend and one of the few people still left in Halbert's finance department who understood how this company used to work back when loyalty and logic actually meant something. His voice on the line was hushed and tense. "Mike," he said, skipping any greeting. "The board's already asking questions. Huntington called early. They're pulling back. Whitman's been in a room with legal since 6. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough for Daniel to understand I already knew what he was about to say next. "You warned them, didn't you?" he finally asked, his voice softer now. "I didn't have to," I said, calm and steady. "The paper trail speaks for itself." And it did. Every document, every clause, every signature had been signed with deliberate intention. I had built safeguards not for revenge, not because I expected to be discarded, but because experience teaches you that power, real power, doesn't come from a title or a parking spot. It comes from knowing how systems work, from understanding where the levers are, and more importantly, when to pull them. By mid-morning, I had confirmation from 3 different people inside the company that panic was spreading like a fire through dry brush. Huntington had frozen all pending wires. Contracts were being flagged. And Whitman, he was reportedly pale and silent in the corner of a conference room, watching legal flip through a binder he probably never even opened. That day, Halber Dynamics didn't just learn they'd lost a key executive. They realized they had let go of the one person holding together the fragile bridge between them and the future they were trying to build. And me? I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. Because it wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about being seen. It was about being counted. And it was about proving, in the clearest possible way, that experience isn't just history, it's foundation. And without it, even the tallest tower falls. By the time the sun broke through the morning fog the next day, I was already dressed, seated at my kitchen table, watching steam curl from a fresh cup of coffee that had long since turned cold. The city outside stirred slowly, oblivious to what was beginning to unravel inside the steel and glass walls of Halber Dynamics. But I wasn't oblivious. I had seen the first cracks form the moment I walked out of that office, and now I could feel the weight of them beginning to spread. At exactly 8:04 a.m., my phone vibrated with a message from Caitlin. "They're in chaos. Whitman's locked in a room with legal." Huntington refused the 9 a.m. call. Board's demanding answers. I sat back, absorbing each word, not with triumph, but with a measured stillness that only comes after years of learning what not to say too quickly. This wasn't satisfaction. Not yet. This was confirmation, the inevitable consequence of arrogance colliding with oversight. And it didn't stop there. 15 minutes later, another text came through. This time from Daniel Vega, whose calm demeanor had always been the one voice of reason in finance. Even when everything else had turned transactional, the board just escalated the issue to Richard Decker. Decker, the chairman himself, The man who usually operated from behind glass walls and offshore schedules was now directly involved. That told me everything I needed to know. The damage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was financial. It was political. And it was public enough that they could no longer pretend it didn't matter. Across town, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and egos to match, Alan Whitman was likely discovering that titles don't shield you from consequences when trust evaporates. I could picture it clearly. The legal team flipping through the contracts I had written and redlined, scanning for loopholes that didn't exist, their fingers trembling as they reached the page that spelled out what a key personnel change meant. And then they would stop, eyes landing on my name, underlined, initialed, and countersigned by both Huntington Ventures and Halber's previous leadership. A clause wasn't just a clause when it cost you tens of millions in investment leverage. From what Caitlin later told me, the first real eruption happened around 9:17 a.m. when one of the Huntington directors, frustrated, humiliated, and feeling duped, demanded a written explanation from Whitman himself. When he tried to deflect, Decker reportedly walked into the room without knocking and asked a single question in front of the entire board. Who authorized the termination of Michael Travis? Silence. No one spoke not at first, and then, in what I imagine was a perfect storm of fear and defensiveness, Whitman stumbled over his words, blaming restructuring protocols, citing generational alignment, and even trying to invoke my recent medical leave as a justification for operational risk. But cancer wasn't the risk that morning. He was. Meanwhile, emails began leaking through internal threads faster than anyone could plug the holes. Employees who had once avoided eye contact with me now exchanged nervous glances with each other, asking quietly in corners how someone like me could be discarded so carelessly. The answer, of course, was simple. It's easy to erase someone when you don't bother to understand what they hold together. At 10:32 a.m., I received an unexpected call. The number was blocked, but the voice on the other end was immediately recognizable. Richard Decker, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. Michael, he began, without preamble. I assume you're aware of what's happening. I didn't answer directly, and he didn't wait for me to. We need to talk today. The board is asking whether this deal is salvageable, and quite frankly, I don't have an answer without you. He paused, exhaled, then added quietly, as if confessing something beneath all the corporate polish, this shouldn't have happened. For a moment, I let the silence sit there, not to punish him, but to remind him what silence from people like me really costs. Then, with a calm I had earned the hard way, I replied, You made a decision based on a resume and a last name. Now you're living with the results. He didn't argue. There was no room for pride left in that call, only urgency. As I ended the conversation and set my phone down, a slow, steady breath filled my chest, not because I felt vindicated, but because I finally understood just how fragile empires built on ego really are. Whitman hadn't fired an employee that morning. He'd pulled out a cornerstone, and now the building was groaning under its own weight. The collapse had begun, and all I had done was step out of the way. It was just after noon when the call came through, not from Whitman, of course, but from Decker's personal assistant, who sounded more nervous than apologetic as she asked whether I'd be available for an in-person meeting within the hour. I could have declined. I could have let them stew longer in the chaos of their own making, but something inside me, not pride, not vengeance, but purpose, told me it was time. Time to look them in the eye, not to beg for what was lost, but to redefine the terms of what would come next. When I arrived at the building I had walked out of just days earlier, there was no receptionist greeting me with small talk, no employees milling around the lobby with clipboards and coffee. The space felt colder now, stripped of its usual buzz, like the hum of a machine finally aware that one of its critical parts had been removed. I stepped into the elevator alone. The mirrored walls reflected a version of me I hadn't seen in years, sharper around the eyes, shoulders squared, not out of defiance but resolve. The kind that comes not from titles but from walking through fire and refusing to let it hollow you out. On the 11th floor, the doors opened to silence. The executive floor, once filled with confident chatter and the tapping of hurried heels, had turned into something quieter, more fragile. And standing just outside the conference room, shifting uncomfortably beneath the weight of consequences he hadn't anticipated, was Alan Whitman. He spotted me before I fully stepped out, and for a moment, the smirk he had worn like armor cracked. He tried to summon it again, that smug veneer of control, and called out just loud enough for others to hear, "Back so soon, Mr. Travis. Couldn't stay away?" I didn't break stride, didn't offer a word, not even a glance. I just walked past him, my footsteps measured and calm, and watched from the corner of my eye as whatever confidence he had left faltered beneath the weight of his own voice, falling into silence. Decker was waiting outside his office. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in spirit, like the truth had caught up to him too, and the weight of a poorly guarded legacy had finally begun to settle into his shoulders. He extended a hand, which I took without warmth, not out of bitterness, but because gestures mean nothing unless trust stands behind them. Inside, the office looked unchanged, the same framed skyline behind his desk, the same leather chairs, but now cluttered with printed emails, revised contracts, and yellow legal pads scribbled with panic. He gestured for me to sit and got straight to it. "We need you back, Michael. Huntington refuses to proceed unless you're the lead liaison. They won't speak to legal, not to Alan, not even to me. They asked for you specifically." I listened, quiet but not passive. His voice lacked the usual confidence, replaced now with something I'd rarely heard in that room before: humility. "I'm willing to reinstate you," he added. "Same title, same compensation." "No," I said, interrupting gently but firmly. "Not same anything." He looked at me, startled, as I leaned forward, placing both hands on the arms of the chair, not to assert dominance, but to ground myself in what I was about to say. "If I come back," I began, steady and clear, "I report directly to you, not Alan. I oversee the Huntington deal independently. I want it in writing, full authority, no interference." He nodded slowly, but I wasn't finished. "I also want formal recognition of the clause Whitman violated in an internal memo, not buried in legalese, but in plain language. Staff deserve to know that mistakes have consequences, especially when they come from the top." He hesitated, then asked quietly, "Anything else?" I studied him for a moment, not out of spite, but to measure whether he really understood what I was asking, whether this was simply damage control or the start of a deeper change. "No more invisible labor," I said finally. "No more late nights without credit. No more leadership without voice. I've carried this company through its darkest seasons. If I return, I do so not as a relic, but as a foundation. And that needs to be acknowledged not with applause, but with autonomy." There was a silence that followed, one not born of resistance, but of realization. Then he reached into a folder, pulling out a pre-drafted document, my name, typed clean across the top, along with the title, Executive Director, Strategic Partnerships, Interim. My terms, signed. I read every word carefully. When I was satisfied, I picked up the pen and signed. As he reached for the phone to dial into the Huntington call, the door burst open, and in stormed Alan, eyes wide, voice sharp. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're seriously putting everything on him?" Decker didn't even flinch. "Enough," he said, voice like a blade. "You gambled and lost. You fired the one person who built the bridge you're now dangling off of. Now you'll step aside, or the board will vote on it for you." For a moment, Alan looked like a man trying to speak underwater, his mouth moving, but no sound strong enough to rise. Then, seeing the look in Decker's eyes and mine, he turned and walked out without another word. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was stillness, the kind that comes after a storm when everything is broken open and what's left finally breathes. When the call connected and Jonathan Pierce's voice came through, I spoke calmly, not just as a returning employee, but as a man who had rebuilt his value on terms no one could take away again. Returning to Halberd Dynamics didn't feel like stepping back into the same world I had left. It felt more like walking through a burned house, still standing on the outside but hollowed within, the smoke of arrogance and betrayal clinging to every surface. On paper, my title was Restored, Elevated, Even, and the Huntington deal had resumed under my sole authority. But I knew enough not to be lulled by the appearance of calm, because men like Alan Whitman don't simply disappear when they lose. They recalculate, quietly and bitterly, and they strike where the light doesn't reach. The first sign came disguised as protocol, an email from HR, masked in neutral language, requesting a routine alignment meeting to discuss leadership roles and internal communication channels harmless enough if you didn't know what to look for. But I had lived long enough, survived too many boardroom battles and whispered campaigns to recognize a veiled maneuver when I saw one. So I arrived 15 minutes early. The conference room was cold and overlit, its fluorescent glare flattening everything into sterile neutrality. I chose the far end of the table, where I could see the door, and placed a leather-bound notebook in front of me, not a prop, but a record. Inside were dates, names, inconsistencies, and a series of documented anomalies I had begun noticing the moment I returned. Duplicate calendar invites, permissions mysteriously revoked, files altered without proper revision history. None of it screamed sabotage, but together they formed a pattern, the subtle erosion of credibility from within. When the HR team entered, they were followed unsurprisingly, though still insultingly, by Alan. He walked in with the false confidence of a man trying to reclaim ground through sheer presence, and though he wasn't supposed to be part of the discussion, no one stopped him. He took a seat directly across from me, his expression tight, rehearsed, and just barely smug. "Michael," the lead rep began, smoothing out a folder she clearly hadn't read thoroughly. "We've received some concerns regarding your recent engagement style. Certain departments feel displaced by the changes." Alan leaned forward, voice laced with feigned concern. "It's understandable. Big transitions can destabilize communication. Some feel you've been, how do I put this, operating a little outside the usual structure." I tilted my head slightly, watching his performance unfold like a script I'd seen a dozen times before. This wasn't about concern. It was a whisper campaign, seeded and watered by someone who couldn't win outright. So he'd chosen instead to chip away from the inside, hoping to paint me as unstable or overreaching to turn my competence into a liability. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. Instead, I opened my notebook. "I anticipated this," I said evenly, sliding several printed pages across the table. "Here are summaries of system access changes made without authorization, timestamps on deleted shared documents, and reports filed with IT security that show irregular login activity linked to accounts within Alan's former project team. I've also attached correspondence with the cybersecurity department and legal, both of whom were looped in as of last Friday." The room shifted, not audibly, but palpably. The HR reps glanced at each other, and Alan's composure cracked, just slightly. His jaw tightened. His hand twitched toward his phone, but stopped mid-reach. He hadn't expected resistance this precise, this quiet, this prepared. "And just so we're clear," I continued, "I have no interest in accusations, but I do take my responsibility seriously. When trust is compromised, whether through incompetence or intent, it's not a personnel issue. It's a leadership one." It was then that Decker entered the room, summoned no doubt by a silent signal from one of the HR reps who realized the gravity of what had just been laid bare. He took one look at the documents, then at Alan, whose carefully built facade was now flickering under the weight of exposure. "Alan," Decker said flatly, "you're done. No fireworks, no shouting. Just 3 words that landed like a final gavel." Alan started to speak something half-formed and defensive, but Decker raised a hand, cutting him off with a look I'd only seen once before, years ago, when a senior exec had misused funds and tried to cover it up. "You sabotaged the only thing holding this deal together after I gave you a second chance. You didn't just risk your reputation. You put this company in jeopardy again." Within the hour, Alan was escorted from the building. No fanfare, no send-off, just a quiet termination and a revoked badge. I remained in that room a few minutes longer, answering questions calmly, explaining the safeguards I'd implemented to keep the Huntington deal secure. When the room emptied and I was finally alone, I sat in silence for a while, not because I was processing what had happened, but because I already had. This wasn't vengeance, it was clarity. You don't always defeat people like Alan by confronting them head-on. Sometimes, you let them walk into the mirror they built themselves and let the reflection do the rest. The days that followed Alan Whitman's departure felt quieter, not in the absence of sound kind of way, but in the way tension slowly drains from a room when people begin to believe they can breathe again. Conversations no longer dipped into whispers when I passed, and colleagues who once avoided my gaze now stopped to speak with something close to respect, though tinged with a quiet shame for having stayed silent while I was cut down. The memo went out internally that Friday, a formal acknowledgement of the clause violation, paired with an unflinching commitment to transparent leadership practices moving forward. It didn't name Alan directly, but it didn't need to. Everyone knew. More importantly, they understood. Sometimes justice doesn't come with banners or applause. Sometimes it's just the quiet rewriting of what people thought they could get away with, a truth restored beneath fluorescent lights. That same morning, Decker called me into his office again. There was no ceremony, no camera-ready moment, just a letter slid across the desk and a simple sentence: "You've earned this." It was an official offer, Chief Operating Officer, Halberd Dynamics, effective immediately. I read the title, let the weight of it settle in my chest, and folded the letter once before slipping it into my bag. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't allow even the whisper of triumph to rise. This wasn't about winning. It was about realignment. Not for them, for me. Later that evening, I stood by the window in my office, and watched the city stretch toward the horizon in that golden, breathless glow that only comes at the end of long days. Below me, the building buzzed with renewal, not from policy changes or restructuring, but from something simpler. Truth had finally reclaimed its place at the table. But it wasn't over. Not really. Power, I'd come to understand, isn't something you hold once and forever. It's something you maintain through consistency, through presence, and through 1,000 quiet decisions no one claps for. And I knew that somewhere in the shadows of boardrooms or corner offices, there would always be another Alan, someone ready to inherit without earning, someone looking to rewrite a narrative they never bothered to read in full. I couldn't control that, but I could control what I stood for and who I refused to become. That night, I stayed late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to remember this moment, not the promotion, not the vindication, but the stillness that comes when your worth is no longer a question but a fact that stands without defense. As I turned off the lights and walked the empty halls toward the elevator, I passed by the break room where, months ago, I'd once stood trying to re-enter a world that had already decided I didn't belong. But now, the air was different, the silence less suffocating, and on the whiteboard by the coffee machine, someone had scribbled in blue ink, "Trust is earned, respect is remembered." I didn't know who wrote it, and I didn't need to. What mattered was that it was their evidence that stories, even the painful ones, have a way of rooting themselves into people's thinking when they're told with truth and grit. As I stepped outside, the night air wrapped around me, cool but not cold, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything to anyone. I had survived the diagnosis, the betrayal, the replacement, and I had returned not just intact, but evolved. This was never about revenge. Not really. It was about reclaiming value in a world too quick to discard those who built it. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. And most of all, it was about making sure that the next time someone like me gets pushed out for being too old, too sick, or simply too inconvenient, there's a precedent that whispers, you may silence them, but you won't bury them. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been cast aside, underestimated, or told your time had passed, know this: your story isn't over. Subscribe to the Underdog's Revenge for more powerful, true-style stories about strength, justice, and finding your voice when the world tries to silence it. You've been the foundation all along. Now it's time they see it.